everybody, welcome back to Emma's Pearls. This is episode 17, and we have with us Brian Hales, who is a historian, and he has written several books on polygamy. This is 1 out of 3, and Gracia Jones, and of course David Denning. So, Brian Hales, we would like to ask you first, what got you into studying polygamy and writing these books and into history?
I had a member of my family, and maybe I should first say thank you for letting me come here and to be with Joseph's descendants and even participate. It's just a wonderful thought to think that there's some of Joseph here amongst you, and I get to participate. But the thing that got me into this topic was that in the late 1980s, a member of my family was excommunicated for joining a polygamous group, a fundamentalist group. And I researched their teachings and eventually wrote a history about fundamentalism. And people, though, were asking me a lot of questions about polygamy, and particularly about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And there were some books that talked about it, mostly by people who didn't believe in Joseph. They portrayed him as a libido-driven fraud. And I thought, there's probably more that could be done. So I hired a research assistant, Don Bradley, and 5 years later, we came out with the 3 volumes. So that was kind of the shift that from fundamentalist polygamy to Joseph Smith and the reasons it occurred. So.
Oh, that's really, really awesome. So I would also like to ask you, why did the celestial marriage covenant have to be restored? Or and tell us the difference between celestial marriage and plural.
The question of celestial marriage is something that, or at least plural marriage, is something that Joseph Smith apparently had, and may have approached the Lord as early as 1831. When he was translating or creating his inspired version of the Bible. We think that's when he started to wonder, how could Abraham and Jacob and Moses in the Old Testament have more than one wife and have it be approved by God? So he takes this question to the Lord, and we don't know when the Lord answered it, but it was written down in the Revelation of July 12, 1843, which is now section 132. And the Lord begins that revelation by saying, Joseph, you've asked me about a plurality of wives. I'm going to answer your question. And he says, I'm going to give you the new and everlasting covenant that as it deals with marriage. And he tells Joseph that if you don't obey it, you will be damned. So you can imagine Joseph is really kind of wondering, okay, what is this? And I better go ahead and practice it. Now, some people have said that must be polygamy, that the Lord is telling Joseph, because his question was about a plurality of wives and how God's going to give the new and everlasting covenant, that he, in fact, is going to tell Joseph that polygamy is a commandment, and he's going to be damned if he doesn't obey it. But that isn't what's going on here. What the Lord is revealing is eternal marriage. And the reason that we know that is severalfold. One is that the covenant, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, is mentioned in verses 19 and 20, and that is where a worthy couple, monogamous couple, is sealed by proper authority. Authority is huge. It's very important. And they live worthily, okay? Then they are promised exaltation and godhood. It's monogamy. And so we learn from those verses that the new and everlasting covenant of marriage is eternal marriage and the need for authority and worthiness. And then, and so even though the first verse talked about a plurality of wives, polygamy is not mentioned again for 20, 25 verses, 30, I think. And so what the Lord is doing is he's answering a question about polygamy, but the answer is to introduce to Joseph Smith authority and the concept of eternal marriage, or what we would call celestial marriage. And in Joseph Smith's time, that ceremony could have been repeated with one man and more than one woman to create a man who's sealed to multiple wives. And so that's how a plurality of wives was introduced. But polygamy has never been, or a plural marriage has never been its own ceremony. It's not a covenant. It's not an ordinance. It's just a repetition of this ceremony that seals a woman to a man. So that was a long answer, but I hope I was able to hit on at least the major parts. Any other questions about that, Angeline?
No, but would you kind of walk us through the timeline of Joseph's wives? You know, there's some people that say he never had plural wives. Some say that he had a whole bunch. Would you talk us through those? And I know there's a big question about Fanny Algier. Will you go into that too?
Sure. When I started my writing the book, this trilogy, I realized there were so many rumors about Joseph. And in fact, if you buy volume one, you'll run into chapters 2 and 3, which I apologize for, because what I had to do was address these rumors to see, is there any basis of truth here? Is there any good documentation? Because they were usually generated by antagonists who want to portray Joseph as negatively as possible. So as you drill down into the data, you realize that really these accusations and things are not on solid foundation. And so I split it into 2 chapters because there were, like a dozen of these, and each one took a historical deep dive to understand, why they are not applicable today. It's interesting, we're 12 years out after my books. If we were to do a second edition, I could just cut those 2 chapters out because pretty much all scholars are recognizing that these claims that are made in those 2 chapters really are not valid, and we can move on to some better documentation. But we do run into Joseph Smith's first plural wife, and I think most scholars agree that this was Fanny Alger or Alger or Alger. I mean, I've met people who spell it Alger, and they actually pronounce it differently depending upon what family it is. People ask me, is it Alger, is it Alger? And so you can probably take your choice there. But what happened was that Mary Elizabeth Rawlins, who was one of Joseph's plural wives, sealed to him for eternity in Nauvoo, she related how in July of 1834, an angel came to Joseph and said, Joseph, part of the restoration is the practice of polygamy, of plural marriage, a plurality of wives. And God wants you to do this. And so the timeline is a little fuzzy, although my friend Don Bradley has written an article recently published where he believes that this first plural marriage of Joseph Smith occurred after April 3rd of 1836 and was the first sealing. Because if you recall, the sealing authority is paramount. You can't freelance a valid plural marriage or any eternal marriage. But this authority was restored to the earth by the prophet Elijah in the Kirtland Temple on April 3rd, 1836. And so my friend Don Bradley has theorized that this marriage to Fanny was the first one of these, and it was after that date. Now, the data is nice, but I'm not fully convinced, so I'm kind of holding out. It might have been before that, but I don't think it was very much before that, because I don't think in the very small house where Joseph was living, Eliza R. Snow was there as a teacher of the family. I mean, there's a lot of people in this small space. If you go to Kirtland today, you can tour the restored Joseph Smith home, and it's very small. And so I don't think Joseph could have had a plural marriage with Fanny Alger for very long before Emma would have found out about it. So whether it was April 3rd of 1836 or in the months before that, I don't think it would have been more than a year before that. But sometime probably in 1835-36, Joseph Smith has a marriage ceremony performed by Levi Hancock. Now, if it was before April 3rd, it would have been a priesthood marriage that God recognized, even if the state of Ohio did not. And so it wouldn't have been sinful. It would have been a bona fide plural marriage. And what's interesting is that everybody that Fanny told about this relationship afterwards, when they heard about it as a plural marriage. And yet what happened was in June of 1836. So this is just at the beginning of summer. In June, Emma finds out about it, and that's a date that we have pretty solid. And so she takes Fanny out of the house. She goes to live with the Webb family, eventually joins up with her own family. But all of those individuals, the Fanny Alger family, her parents, Her uncle, Levi Hancock, who performed the marriage ceremony, and the Webb family, with whom she stayed for a few weeks before joining the family, they all related later. It was a plural marriage. But the interesting thing is that the people that Joseph told about it, like Emma and Oliver Cowdery, they didn't accept it as a valid plural marriage. They thought it was adultery. And so there were rumors that came out from Oliver and others that called it adultery rather than polygamy. But these were all people that Joseph was talking to, not the people that Fanny was talking to. But the marriage ended, and Fanny may have actually been pregnant. There's one bit of evidence that suggests that might have been the case, and some scholars hold that that was in fact true, but we're not really sure. There's no record of a baby being born to Fanny for another 5, 6, 7 years. So if there was a child, it's hidden, or the child passed away. But this was a bona fide plural marriage and could have been consummated by Joseph and Fanny. That's kind of how we look at this, as the first genuine plural marriage that Joseph entered into. But Fanny, her family went
Ask,
to Indiana. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a
how old
question?
was
Or
Fanny? Yeah, how
she
old
was
was Fanny?
she was 19 in 1835. Yeah, sometimes people conflate her and Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14. You see that all the time among some of the critics who aren't looking too closely at the data, and they'll conflate those two. But no, Fanny was old enough to make a decision. And in fact, Joseph Smith asked Fanny's parents for permission through her uncle Levi Hancock, which is also common that Joseph would work through an intermediary. So this isn't some, whoa, Fanny, you are attractive to me. Let's have a plural marriage so we can consummate it. That's not what happened at all. This was a request for permission from the parents. There was a marriage ceremony performed, and Joseph considered her a plural wife after that. So that would be the first one. Any more questions about Fanny?
Nope.
Uh, Beyond that, it's difficult to document anything going on before Joseph and his family went to Nauvoo. In other words, from about the summer of 1836, when this marriage blew up and Emma was not happy, Joseph learned something about Emma that day, and that was that she was not going to accept plural marriage easily. And well, she later did for a short period of time, but for the most part, it was really a trial for her, understandably. But Joseph, after 1836, he travels to Missouri. He's thrown into Liberty Jail for 6 months. Eventually, they find their way to Quincy and then up to Nauvoo, which is where we are right now. If you could see out the window here, you'd see Nauvoo, and the Mississippi River is just a stone's throw from where we're at here. But here in Nauvoo, he was able to readdress this issue, and from Mary Elizabeth Rollins, we learned that there were 3 visits of this angel. The first one was in 1834. The second one we don't have a date for, but I would guess it was before 1841, because in April of 1841, Joseph once again had a marriage ceremony. This one was with Louisa Beeman, and it was in April of 1841. Now, my friend Don Bradley, again, thinks that this occurred in 1842, and it certainly fits Joseph's marrying pattern better in 1842. But the first one that we think we know of is in 1841, so the angel would have probably come before that. But what Joseph Smith did, other than this one marriage to Louisa Beeman, is that all of the other next half a dozen or so sealing ceremonies, and every one of these marriages had a person there who was doing the sealing. It wasn't Joseph. Joseph never performed a sealing for himself, playing the part of a groom and playing the part of the groom, as well as the part of maybe a witness and also the sealer. That never happened, so far as we have any record. Joseph always had witnesses, always had somebody who was authorized to perform the sealing. But all of these sealings for the next 6 months or so are for Joseph to women who were already married. And I argue very strongly that these were just eternity-only sealings without sexuality, because they were just for the next life. And then what we find is that In February, early February of 1842, that's when Mary Elizabeth Rollins says the angel came for the third time. And this time he has a sword, and it's not a flaming sword. Okay, I've accumulated 20 something accounts from 9 individuals who knew Joseph, who all remembered him talking about an angel with a sword who came and said, Joseph, we want you to do this restoration of the practice of plural marriage. And Joseph apparently was hesitant, understandably, because he knew Emma was not going to be happy about it. But I personally think the reason that his first sealings were just for women for eternity was because he didn't want to enter into the full polygamy knowing that it would hurt Emma. And I think, to me, that it's very clear that that's what Joseph is doing. He's trying to appease the angel who's saying, Joseph, we want this restored. And he's also trying to keep Emma happy by just doing these sealings that would not involve sexuality. But the angel comes a third time with the sword in 1842 in February. And it's after that date that we find Joseph Smith is then proposing to young women who aren't married. And after that date, we have some evidence that the marriages are consummated, evidence of sexuality in some of those marriages. So I'm going to pause. Any questions or anything? This is maybe just a review. It sounds like it is, but that kind of brings us up to 1842 or so.
I am curious why. So you said that he married these women celestially that were married in order to just appease the commandment, right?
Well, I think that's part of it. Plus, there were several of them, not all of them, that were legally married to men who were not devout Latter-day Saints. So these men were not going to accept eternal marriage, and so they couldn't be sealed
Mm.
eternally. And we can use the term celestial marriage. I just call it an eternal sealing, but that could not occur with their husbands because they either weren't married members of the church or they weren't devout. And so these women chose to be sealed to Joseph Smith. And Joseph said, well, and as we know, and this is consistent with today, every exalted being is married. And so they knew they needed to have this ordinance. And so they then went to Joseph and they were sealed to him. And that was the type. Now there are the critics will say, oh no, this is where the libido driven fraud Joseph Smith wanted to get more sex, and so he was sealed to other men's wives so he could do that. But the problem with that interpretation, and I wrote an article that was published just a little over a year ago in the Journal of Mormon History on this. It's called polyandry. And I don't believe it ever actually happened, because if it had, it would have been the most controversial thing Joseph ever taught or ever did. It's controversial today. I mean, let's face it. When people talk about Joseph Smith and polygamy, one of the top things they ask about is his sealings to legally married women, because it just feels wrong, and it is wrong in the Bible. In Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, it says if a woman is sexually involved with another man, it's adultery. So the Bible puts this huge hurdle that anybody today would have to somehow with strong doctrine say that Romans is wrong if they are going to actually be a second husband to a devout Christian. And I'm arguing that never happened, because if it had, people would have been wondering about it who were participants, and the critics would have had a heyday. John Bennett knew about these. William Law knew about these sealings, but neither one of them exploited them in their antagonistic literature. And I think it's because they knew they were just spiritually old. It was just for eternity only. They weren't true marriages in the sense of what the law enforcement would be concerned.
Okay. And then do you, in your study, understand why polygamy was important for the restoration, why the angel would push this on Joseph?
It's a great question. Why did God command Joseph Smith in 1834 and then again in 1842 to restore this? And the answer is we don't know. There is no church president, key holder, presiding priesthood authority who ever explained why God commanded plural marriage between the 1840s and 1890. There have been leaders who have kind of made up ideas, and some of them seem kind of crazy to me, but I have polygamy in my own mind. And I'm grateful for it because who knows where or when I would have been born had it not been there. But it absolutely was a sifting process for the saints in that day. And my late wife Laura made the comment that in the 1800s, plural marriage was a challenge for the members as they obeyed the commandment. And polygamy is a challenge for members today to just believe polygamy was a commandment. And we find that to be, there's a huge movement today by people who deny Joseph had entered into plural marriage. And it's so unfortunate because it's an apostate teaching and it's a halfway house to just leaving the faith altogether. And these people that are advocating it, I worry about them, that if we go forward 5 years or 10 years and look back, where will these people be? Because it's a false teaching and it will not help them grow closer to God or help them with their covenants. So I feel bad for them and what they're doing. But other questions?
Okay, so then you brought us up to 1841, right? And so, how did the marriages go after that? And I believe he had 34 wives. Was that
It
correct?
depends. Yeah, the number of his wives is still something we're not absolutely sure of. If you read Fawn Brodie, who was the first person to publish a list, and this is back in 1945, she had 48 on her list. Now, two of them are redundancies, and some of them are very, very dubious. But we're grateful to even Fawn Brodie for at least trying to create a list of these women. The probably the most accepted list has 33, and that's by Todd Compton. My list has 35, but a couple of them I'm kind of iffy on. There are other lists. George D. Smith has 38, and then I know that the historians working with the church are trying to come up with their own list and their list. And I'm not sure it's not finished yet. But what they've done is they've split it into three groups. There's a group who told us that they were Joseph's wives. And it's very credible. And then there's a second group where the women didn't say it, but people close to the relationship did, and it's very reliable. And then there's a third group where there's just kind of circumstantial evidence that we have today that they were sealed to Joseph. And so with those three lists, you get somewhere between 28 and 38. But I don't agree with some that are on that third list that they've got. So anyway, we don't know for sure. And the question comes up commonly, why was Joseph Smith sealed to so many women? And you could reason in your mind that if the angel came and said, Joseph, restore this practice, he could have been sealed to 2 or 3 or maybe 5 or 6 women, and the angel would have been perfectly happy. And the answer to that is we simply don't know. Joseph Smith thought in big terms. Eternity was before his view, as he talked about the visions that were constantly rolling before his view. And he would compare himself to other prophets of other dispensations. So I think that he saw himself as a prophet who could now have this privilege of plural marriage, and he just felt very comfortable exercising it for himself. I don't think he needed to have that many. I think it's hard for us today to understand why he would choose to have so many, and there isn't really a good answer. It's not sinful. It's not sinful to do that. The women all had their choice. Joseph didn't coerce any woman. We have an account of 5 different women who Joseph Smith proposed to directly or through an intermediary who all turned him down. And we only know about those proposals because we heard about it later, either from the family or from the woman herself. Joseph didn't try to destroy their reputation. Now, there were 2 additional women, Sarah Pratt and Jane Law, who came public with accusations that Joseph tried to seduce them. And Joseph pushed back against them publicly, saying that's not true. And there may have been something there about these, because the women weren't happy with their husbands, that Joseph said, you could be sealed to me as he done with others. But the idea that he would have done the things that they had said, I think is really a stretch. And these women, of course, were both excommunicated and became very antagonistic. So do you want me to continue from 1942 onward?
May I say something?
Oh, of course.
I've had this question fielded to me from all directions, and when I was new in the church, I knew nothing. And when I learned about this principle, it didn't bother me, because if Joseph was a prophet, he was given the direction to do this, then he had a reason, because he was asked by the Lord to do it or commanded. And that has never been a trouble to me. It is a trouble to some people. In fact, some women get extremely irate and anxious about it. And so anyway, I would be doing a fireside about gathering the family and about the restoration. And sure enough, someone would raise their hand and say, how many wives did Joseph have? And my answer is kind of dumb, but it satisfied
I doubt
everybody
that.
at the meeting. And that is, I don't know, but if I ever, let's see, if I get to heaven, I'll ask him if I ever get there. And, everybody would sort of snicker and we'd go on with our regular conversation, because I never wished to stand up in public and make any effort to defend or criticize that principle. I just left it alone. But when I was doing the article for the Ensign in 1992, I really came to the point of realizing that it needed to be addressed, that a prophet instituted it into the church, and that a prophet ended it in the church. The bookends of those two prophets satisfied me as a fact, because I believe in them as being true prophets, Joseph and Wilfred Woodruff. Now, the fact that really surprised me is, in my research, when I discovered that in a massive order by the president of the church to stop practicing that principle, many probably didn't, but for the most part, the faithful members of the church yielded to that request, or to that prophetic proclamation. And that just really surprised me. And I did the book on Fredonia, Arizona, and that was sent down there on a telegraph. And the people who had lived their lives doing this accepted it. Isn't that interesting? Yet there were those who didn't, and we know all about that. But my own heart and faith tells me that the people genuinely believed in their prophets of their church, our church. And when they were asked to follow through on something, by and large, the majority did peacefully do it. Kind of interesting. Now, does that mean that we're just sheep in the church and just do everything we're told? I don't think so. I think that the Spirit worked on people, helped them understand, and it was difficult for many families. My husband's family had some of the women lived in Arizona and some lived in Utah. And those families loved each other and supported each other and were loving. On one case, his ancestor said to the son of the other wife, "Oh, you have caught all these quail for Thanksgiving. It would be so wonderful if you would share those quail with the other family." And this boy was very chagrined. He'd caught the quail, it had been hard, it had been difficult, and now he's being asked by his father to give them away. And then his father said, "I promise you, even very short time available for him to do it, I promise you that if you will have plenty of quail for your dinner." And sure enough, he gave those quail, and he had plenty for his own family where he was. those kinds of stories are tender to learn of the interaction between the families.
Great, thank you, Gracia. I like that. Those are cute. I love the story. Um, so, Brian, you were going to tell us what happened after 1841.
Yeah, we maybe before we do, let me sidebar for just a second off of something that Gracia said. When it comes to the topic of plural marriage, it's controversial. And I was in conversation with a church historian a few years ago, and he made the observation that, most of the controversies in the church, once you learn more about them, they cease to really bother you much because you understand what's going on and that it's probably been misrepresented by the critics. But he also observed that polygamy is not that way. The more you learn about it, it may not make you necessarily feel much better. And I've puzzled over why that is. And I think one of the big reasons is that men can do it, women can't. It's simply unfair, and it's hard for us, especially in this day and age where we are so gender sensitized, and that's not a bad thing, I'm saying, but it's really hard for us to actually expect to feel good about something men can do and women can't, and attribute that to God. Although there's lots of other things that we could draw parallels to that we seem to accept okay, but I think it's unrealistic, really, at least for me, to come away from my study of polygamy and actually feel good about the practice itself. Now, with that said, there is something we can feel good about, and that is Joseph Smith's worthiness. Joseph wasn't perfect, but he was always worthy to be the prophet that we believe that he was. He might have been able to handle plural marriage and Emma Smith better. Certainly, there's room there for question marks. And there may have been other things he could have done better. But none of those were the types of sins or indiscretion that would have prevented him from being able to still be a prophet to us. And so this is what I tell people, that don't try to get a testimony of plural marriage. I mean, you may have a spiritual experience, because one of the interesting things about the introduction of polygamy in Nauvoo right here is that there are lots of reports of dreams and angels visiting and other supernatural, we would call them spiritual events, especially for women, but they report this spiritual support to introduce this practice. It's really kind of a remarkable thing. And I have a website called josephsmithpolygamy.org, and there's a tab over there on the accounts from individuals who participated. You can read about some of those, but it really is interesting how God seemed to want this introduced then, and offered some supernatural help, if you will, in this form to help people accept it, because it was a very difficult thing. So I just kind of wanted to introduce those kind of concepts, because it's still a kind of a very difficult thing. And we also should say that we can have a very strong testimony of Jesus Christ, whether we have one of polygamy or not. I don't know that you have to be able to stand up at testimony meeting and say, no, polygamy was a true thing or whatever. But we can certainly go to the Savior and just say, all things will be made known in time. So if we look now to 1842, I mentioned that the angel came a third time in February of 1842. And what's interesting is by that time in Nauvoo, and keep in mind, Joseph Smith is dead 2 years and 3 or 4 months later. There are only 3 polygamists, authorized polygamists in Nauvoo, and that's Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, and then Joseph. And actually, Heber and Kimball, we don't have dates for their marriages, so it may have even been later. And the reason I say that is all of Joseph's plural marrying and all the polygamy in Nauvoo that happened during Joseph's lifetime occurred during about 2 years and 2 months. And so things are happening, and it's all done relatively secretly. I mean, there's some people who saying the walls had ears and they couldn't say anything, and then we have other accounts of Brigham Young being asked point blank, are you guys doing polygamy? And he's answering, yes, we are. Or Joseph is being asked, are you? He was asked once, I hear you're doing polygamy, and Joseph says, I can't answer that because you're a policeman and you will arrest me. And the policeman said, "No, I won't arrest you. I want to know the truth." And that person actually was later authorized to take a plural wife. So the polygamy is being somewhat secretly being spread, but there's plenty of rumors, and it's coming out. And this is throughout the end of 1842. And then in 1843, what we find is that even though it's secretly being disseminated in Nauvoo, there are some key players who have not yet learned about plural marriage from Joseph Smith's own mouth. And this would be Emma Smith, who probably learned about the eternity only sealings before she learned about the full plural marriage relationships with consummation of that. And then William Law, Joseph Smith's second counselor in the first presidency. He didn't learn about it until probably June of 1843. And then Hiram Smith. Hiram Smith was pushing back against this idea, against these rumors, even though he had a hunch that maybe Joseph was the source of these. He was pushing back against it. And in fact, we were down in the homestead, which is down next to the river here, a week ago, going on the tour because the Utah Church now owns all of the real estate there except for the grave sites. And the missionaries told us a story. You've probably heard it before, but it was about how Hiram stood up and he said, "We have the scriptures here," and he laid down the Doctrine and Covenants in the Book of Mormon in the Bible, and he said, "This is our guide." And at that point, Joseph Smith was sitting next to Brigham, and he elbowed Brigham and said, "Get up and teach." And Brigham got up at that point, and he later recounted he was pretty full of I can't remember lead, or he was ready to teach, and he said, "These are very important books, but having the living oracle, having the living prophet who can guide us, that is more important." Now, the undercurrent of that story, and I don't know that the sister missionaries who told it realized what they were saying, but this was about plural marriage. Hiram was pushing back against the idea because it wasn't in the books that he had shown, and Brigham standing up and saying that if a prophet of God were to restore the practice, then we would be right to follow it. And so that's kind of the thing that's going on in the 1843 era. And then we know that by May, June, Emma is accepting of it. She participates in 4 plural marriages, and yet she just can't handle it. Emily Partridge tells us after her plural marriage, which Emma had approved of and participated in, that from that very night, she stayed with Joseph that night, but from that moment, the next day after, Emma would not let them near Joseph. She couldn't handle it. She made a decision that I just can't do polygamy. And from that point forward, we find her apparently tolerating it. But privately, she's telling women, your men are going to take more plural wives. You got to stop this. You got to push back. In 1844, she, as president of the Relief Society, releases a statement that condemns polygamy and kind of feeds into some of the antagonistic outside forces that are happening there. But what is interesting with respect to Joseph is that the last plural wife that he took appears to be an eternity-only sealing to Brigham Young's sister, Fanny. Fanny Young is her name, and this is November 1st of 1843. So, see, we started in 1842, 1843. Joseph is being sealed to lots of different women. Some are for eternity only, but some are for time and eternity. And each one of these women believes that she is Joseph's wife. These aren't just trysts like John C. Bennett was pushing, where people could come together without a ceremony or something. No, these were all marriage ceremonies. These were all ladies who thought they would be sealed to Joseph in the next life. They considered him to be her husband in this life. But all of this stops in November of 43. And Fanny Young was talking to Joseph in the presence of Brigham, her brother. And Fanny says, "Oh, I don't want to be married. When I get to heaven, I just want to be an angel up there." And Joseph's response was, "You talk very foolishly. You don't know what you're going to want there. You need to have this sealing ordinance. Brigham, seal her to me." And she was older. There's no discussion that this would have been a marriage that was consummated or anything. And so Brigham performed that ceremony. And that appears to be the final plural wife that Joseph had. And then for the remaining 8 or 9 months of his life, he did not contract any more plural marriages so far as we have any record. and exactly what was going on. Some of these plural wives lived in the mansion house, and there are statements that suggest that Emma was kind of the first wife and kind of regulating things, but we have statements like from Emily Partridge where they were not able to spend time with Joseph even though they considered him their husband. And so we don't really know exactly what's going on after, during the fall and winter of 1843-44 with respect to plural marriage. But we do know that Joseph continued to teach it and authorize additional plural marriages, that Emma and some of the Relief Society were involved with kind of pushing back at that. So any questions about any of those specific events? Gracia, I saw you nodding your head. Any thoughts?
I wanted to I wanted to say here that on May 28th, 1843, Emma and Joseph were sealed for time and eternity. And in September of 1843, they received the calling and election made sure in the fullness of the priesthood, and that Joseph actually introduced the fullness ordinances to at least 24 couples, the 12 being part of that and others. And not all of those made it west, but those who made it west were then had every ordinance given them. And I have really felt that 1843 in September was kind of the final capstone of the restoration that Joseph had to accomplish, and Emma had to be his partner in it, and she was. So we do know a little bit about what went on in the fall of 1843, and at some point, what happened with Hiram is that after he was so resistant, that the story is that he said, well, I have two wives. One died and one's here. I love them both. I know what I can do for one, but what can I do for the other? And Joseph said to him, you may have them both. And so on the 29th of May, 1843, he was sealed to his first wife, Jerusha, and to his wife, Mary Fielding, for all eternity. So it isn't a mystery. It isn't sneaky or weird or awful. It was a means of opening up a way for situations that would come to many, many women who would never have an opportunity. Otherwise, one is dead, one is alive. We still do temple work for women who are dead, and they're sealed to their live husband through proxy. Those ordinances are here, and they're in the temple today, where it is a great blessing to those of us who believe in these principles to have that comforting knowledge that this is available. Now, I don't think that everybody, maybe even Joseph included, understood every nuance of the process that was, but he did have direction, and it was actually restored in this dispensation and is with us today. Now, there are some women that go absolutely insane if they think their husband's sealed to some other woman besides. In fact, I've known women that are kicking up because our presidency are married to second wives, and they're sealed in eternity with all of them, and that means polygamy. It's just interesting how people are reacting and ignorant of what the full celestial purpose of these things might be. My own take on it, sorry to say so much, but my own take on it is the Book of Mormon says, if I command you, to raise up seed, then that would be a different thing than having it not be proper. Well, what was the purpose of it? To raise up 2 generations of strong Latter-day Saints to go on missions. And actually, it's only been a few years since that progeny was the bulk of the missionary work in the world for the church. So think about all those things and ask yourself, well, who am I to sit here in 2025 and criticize something that we really can't uncover everything. And if we could uncover it all, there would be good and bad, ups and downs, good days and bad days for everybody involved. That's my take on it, that it raised a posterity that became fabulous missionaries all over the world. And now it's not necessary anymore. After Wilford Woodruff gave the proclamation, it was no longer necessary. But yes, there were families that really were struggled with that ending, and many of them struggled very badly, and some didn't quit. You know, it's just a fact of life that mortals do what they do. But Heavenly Father has a purpose for things. And here we are with a wonderful gospel, far exceeding the importance of this subject. The principles of the gospel, the promises of eternity, are here for those who desire to have them and are willing to sacrifice what it takes to live for them here. My take, that's all. I'm not saying anybody's wrong or right.
I love that, Gracia. I think that's very important. I like that.
Maybe I could just
Um,
add one thought, and that is that, and I love that, Gracia, everything you said. Uh, there are people who today, of course, don't like polygamy, and I think I mentioned some of the reasons. It's a hard one to feel good about. But the reality is that we know almost nothing about eternal marriage. And we know even less about eternal plural marriage. As you said, why would somebody get so worried about something we know almost nothing about? Fearing the unknown is certainly not going to bring any kind of a positive effect upon us or our faith. And if we can just admit that we don't know what President Nelson with 2 sealed wives, or President Oaks with 2 sealed wives, that can be offensive to some people, but they're being offended by what they suppose is going to happen in eternity. But in eternity, there is an infinite amount of resources, of time, of love, So we can't even imagine what a marriage in that setting would be like. And I don't think that we could be justified in taking offense that knowing that is part of our religious teachings. So.
yeah, I think it's also interesting because we don't second think the Bible and how many prophets had plural wives. It was back then, it made sense.
Well, the
And so,
12 tribes of Israel.
yeah.
Or, how can you get all out of sense with the Bible honoring these 12 tribes? And we are seeking to find them and restore them and bringing them back to, well, does that mean that plural marriage has to come back? Probably not. I don't know, unless all the men get killed off in some way and the women are lonely. We don't have to worry about what could or wouldn't happen. It's not our worry. I trust Heavenly Father to take care of these. And He helped women move into that program peacefully and even joyfully in a lot of cases. So, but we are not living in their day. And I had a very interesting conversation with a daughter of Joseph Fielding Smith. And she said women were complaining about the idea of plural marriage, and she said, that is exactly how you should feel. Right now, there is no spirit on this earth that will confirm to you that it is proper. No true spirit on this earth that will commit to you that it's proper now, because the church has ended that practice in this life. Was interesting to me how she answered those worried women. Well, that's exactly how you should feel right now. Simple.
Makes sense. I like that. Um, Brian, I'd also like to ask you a lot. Well, the descendants of Joseph and Emma, I know we heard from, I don't know, it's one of her sons, Joseph Smith III or Alexander. He had asked Emma about plural marriage and if Joseph participated, and she said no. What would you say to that?
Well, this is one of the big maybe reasons that this polygamy denying movement has gotten so much traction, is that we really do have statements from Emma that come from pretty reliable sources where she seems to deny what really happened. And there's lots of evidence that Emma knew what was going on, and yet in the later day, I think she may have taken that position because in 1860, as you know, Joseph Smith III became president of the RLDS Church. The RLDS Church was kind of founded on two ideas. One is that the next president should be in the lineage of Joseph, and that Joseph Smith Jr. was not a polygamist. Those were kind of the two big things. So if Emma had come out after 1860 and said, well, yeah, you know, Joseph was a polygamist, she would have been contradicting her own son, who was president of the RLDS Church. It's my understanding Emma never formally joined that church, but she did participate in their services. But had she actually come out and said anything else, then she would have been in contradiction to her sons. And what we find in the statements from Emma is they're mostly filtered through her sons or other RLDS missionaries. So you kind of wonder about that, but there's several, and but she does seem to be echoing what Joseph Smith III was saying. And we also have very good evidence that Joseph Smith III knew that Joseph Smith, his father, was a polygamist, but that Joseph Smith III, and I respect him. He was a very charismatic individual, but I don't understand why the cognitive dissonance that he was able to perpetuate, because we find him privately acknowledging his father's polygamy, but publicly pushing back against it at every turn in every way that he has power. And that, again, is something I don't understand.
He even had 3 wives, one at a time, and 17 children. And he at one time in his memoirs makes the statement that he told them, if that turns out to be a true principle, you will deal with it. And that is an absolute thing from his memoirs that he said to his first, second, and third wife, in heavenly days. He, of all the family, gains the most from the fact that his temple work has been done. I could share some things that are very deeply spiritual to me because of my work with the family temple work, but I probably shouldn't say it on here. But I have, on spiritual authority, my heart, a knowledge that they are all very happy in this after the fact blessings that are theirs. That's as much as I can say about that.
That's great. Were you going to continue, Brian, or could I ask you a few other questions that could take us in a different route?
Probably the only additional thing to add is that by introducing William Law to plural marriage and having him reject it, it kind of put a very formidable force opposing Joseph, not just on polygamy, but just generally. And you might even argue that if polygamy had not happened, or if it had been kept even secret from William Law, maybe Joseph would not have died when he did, because plural marriage was certainly one of the primary things that pushed William Law to try to not necessarily get Joseph killed, I don't think, but he wanted to put Joseph in jail. He brought a suit against him in Carthage, not alleging polygamy, because technically polygamy wasn't against the law, because these were spiritual marriages. It wasn't bigamy because the government didn't recognize them. But you can't have sexual relations outside of a marriage relationship. That's actually against the law, and the church didn't, or the state didn't recognize the marriages to be marriages. So that's what William Law did. So there was talk that towards the end Joseph Smith may have decided to give it up. Emma made this claim privately. Brigham Young once said that people said Joseph gave it up, but I didn't know that he did. I wasn't aware. He was worn out with it, with polygamy, is what Brigham said. We have William Marks, who you probably are aware of, told several different stories about how Joseph had empowered him and the High Council to excommunicate all the polygamists. The story has lots of problems with it. I don't necessarily believe it, but it wouldn't surprise me if we were to learn that by June of 1844, Joseph was really kind of tired with it, and maybe thought maybe we don't have to push this as a primary practice at this time. But whether that happened, I think there's too much ambiguity in the documents. So anyway, that would be kind of a postscript on that it did lead to Joseph Smith's death, and we could only speculate what might have happened if Joseph had continued to go west and plural marriage had been set up in the west with him still leading the church till he became 90. I mean, those are just wonderful thoughts to me, but we'll never know.
From 1842, when the Relief Society was organized, several of the meetings, the prophet made statements to the women, "I will not be with you much longer." I think he was aware that his time was coming to an end, and he even told the brethren those kinds of things, and no one wanted to hear it or wanted to understand or couldn't even engage it as a possibility. David, you made the comment about that if those brethren had not been sent out of Nauvoo, they would have stood in the way of Joseph going to Carthage. Do you want to say something about that, David?
Well, what was impressed upon me was how much Joseph loved his friends and those who were loyal to him. And what was impressed upon me was he sent them away because he needed them to survive. If they were in Nauvoo and he had gone to Carthage, they would have died with him. They would have given their lives to protect him. And he needed them. He needed the keys of the priesthood and the authority to act and to continue to build the kingdom of God, because he did the foundation. But the building needed to continue on with the keys that he had passed on to the quorum of the 12 apostles.
And he knew way back early that a potential giving of his life might be required. And I wish I could quote you the exact, in I believe section 5 or 6, and some other, if they do to you what they did to me, this is Christ speaking to Joseph in Revelation, then, so be it. That's pretty much what it says. In almost all of his life, he probably knew at some point he would have to seal his testimony with his giving of his life. And he went to Carthage voluntarily. He could have escaped. they thought about escape. And then they thought, no, let's go back and do this thing. And Hiram says, we'll be killed. And he says, yeah, probably. But they accepted that and went. And then they really couldn't have a case against them that would have held them. So they changed the charge to treason, which was a trumped-up charge. And that let them hold him over those days. That made it possible for the mob to do its work. Isn't that kind of interesting? Because he could have escaped easily at any point. And he chose to go there and be there, and Hiram wouldn't leave him. Now, had Oliver Cowdery stayed close with him and stayed in the church, he probably would have been the one who went with Joseph to Carthage, but it turned out to be his brother, and what a treasure of a brother Hiram is to him. So, I don't know. As I look back on this, we know that point of full restoration had been accomplished, and now what was left was the final closing chapter. And there's been a big movie out, or some kind of a documentary saying that John Taylor and rather Willard Richards actually killed Joseph in the jail room. And then, what did they do? Throw his body out the window? All of these ridiculous and horrifying, stupid stories are built up to do what? To make the church look bad, to make Joseph look bad, to falsify the facts. And there were too many witnesses to make that fly, but they've made it a movie that actually people see and believe. So I just think we're just living in a very interesting age where, no, we can't know everything, but somehow by the feeling of our heart, we can know that Joseph was a true prophet and that he fulfilled the job of the restoration. He laid a foundation. He never got to see anything really, really fully finished. And that had to be done after the saints were in a free place where they could build temples and do those things. So that's my witness and testimony. I have to say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Gracia.
Amen. Now, I would like to add something along that lines, that after they were driven from Missouri, Joseph went, and I'm going to actually quote Lucy Mack Smith from her 8th October 1845 conference talk, where she had actually asked Brigham Young to allow her to address the saints. And he said yes. In fact, just to add on there, it was the first time that a woman ever addressed General Conference. And it did not happen for another 50 or so years. But she says, and I quote, Joseph then went to the city of Washington, as he had had a revelation to importune at the governor's feet and at the president's feet. And the Lord said, if they would not heed him, he would vex the nation. When he got home, he preached down between Mr. Durfee's and the mansion house. He told the brethren and the sisters that he had done all he could for them. Says he, they are determined we shall not have justice while we stay in Nauvoo. But, says he, keep good courage. You shall never suffer for bread as you have done before. Said he, all these cases are recorded on earth, and what is recorded here is recorded in heaven. Now, says he, I am going to lay this case of their taking away our property. I am going to take it up before the highest court in heaven. He repeated it 3 times. Little did I think he was going to leave us so soon to take this case to heaven. We never could get justice till he took it there. The Lord has got even the marshal there. They know all of our sufferings, and don't you think our case is being tried?
Wow.
Unquote.
I like that.
When I found out when I was doing my research, I wept. This is the mother who has lost all these sons, and in that same talk she says all that happened to her sons, and then she says, and William is gone, and I know not where. He had taken off and gone away. And when I am happy to say that as I've followed up with the restoration of our family organization, we have William descendants that we know and love and interact with. And I'm happy to report that William, although it's never been officially recorded, it definitely did happen. He was baptized before he died by LDS missionaries. And in his old age, as a missionary for the reorganized church, he preached Joseph's restoration. And he preached it really well. And I think it's interesting that all we ever know about William is that he was a bad boy and he caused a lot of trouble. Well, he was. He had a temper and he got into trouble a lot. But in the end, he was a preacher of the restoration of the gospel as Joseph had taught it. Interesting.
Now, with that, Mom, today I was studying. Well, I was doing my task of scanning, and one of the documents that I scanned, I was actually reading that some of the issues that William had in 1844 and 1845 after the martyrdom was because he had basically performed a couple plural marriages without authorization. And then he went back and he said, and they had actually excommunicated, and I don't remember the name of the person, but they had excommunicated him, and William went and said, no, but don't excommunicate him. So they unexcommunicated that person, but it shows that William actually understood and knew about plural marriage as well.
Oh yeah, he really did. In fact,
he practiced
two women that he got sealed to unofficially became George A. Smith's wives, came west and raised large families.
So.
I guess we're telling you things you never heard. But these issues divided of all these 100 years, over 100 years, of the descendants of Joseph and Emma. And our work in this day has been to find those people and help them, because a great many haven't any clue that they have this lineage or these wonderful ancestors. And so my job, over my whole life since I've been in the church, almost 70 years, has been to find these cousins and help them actually know the best that we can share of their ancestors and give them a pride in their lineage so they no longer have to say, don't tell anybody, which is what I was told when I was very young. Don't tell anybody you're related. That was the most common denominator of all the siblings of the prophet. The descendants, most of them were told, don't tell anybody. And several of them were never told until they were adults, that they were even related remotely. And now we want all those descendants to understand and not enter into controversy or arguments about doctrines or worries about that. Just know that you're from a lineage that has a very sacred and honorable past. And you can be proud of it.
I like that. Thank you, Gracia. Did you want to add anything else, Brian?
No, I've just enjoyed your comments, and I can't imagine what it would be like to have that kind of a connection. But it's been enjoyable to be with you and hear about these things that are your family. These are family stories, and for me, they're just history. So it's wonderful.
Thank you for what you've done. I think that reading your series, your books, has been such a validating experience for me. I never had a problem with the issue, but I have certainly appreciated having the documentations. And Don Browley, I really think he's tops as a researcher, and I've enjoyed knowing him. And now I'm so happy to meet you and have this opportunity to thank you for what you've done. One of the things that you said in your book that may not be exactly these words, but what you said was you found nothing dishonorable in his intent or behavior. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't say it that well, honestly, but that
That's what I
certainly
said.
is the thing. Well, I like the way you say it. I may borrow that term. There was nothing dishonorable. That is just so true. Joseph was trying, and he wasn't perfect, but he was always worthy, and that's kind of more the way I've said it. But I look forward to meeting him someday and asking him, Joseph, how did I do in defending you? Because I hope I did well. That's what I would like to hear. So.
I like that. I do have a few other questions. Um, so a lot of people say that Joseph married a 14-year-old or young girls. Um, that went weird. Okay. But did he marry young girls?
Do you know, we know that he was sealed in a ceremony set up by Heber C. Kimball. He was sealed to Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14. And it's really clear. There's really good evidence this marriage was never consummated. There's no evidence the two of them were ever alone again. They were together on the Maid of Iowa once, but there was a chaperone there. And so the idea that she that this was Joseph looking for a sexual experience with a 14-year-old is simply not supported. And what we do know is that it was set up by Heber, and we have no evidence that Joseph was the one who wanted this in the first place. And Joseph was also sealed to another girl who might have been 15, but she was a very good friend. It was Maria. I'm blocking on her last name, but she was a good friend of Helen, and her father was a good friend of Joseph as well. And we don't have any details on what that happened there, but she was also sealed to Joseph. So those are the two young ones. But we don't find any evidence that there was a 16-year-old as well, Flora Woodworth. And that's an interesting marriage because she was 16 and she had a confrontation with Emma, and it was nasty. And the next day she went out and got civilly married to a Carlos Gov, who wasn't even a member of the church. And she lived out the rest of her life as Carlos Gov's wife. And the sad part of that is that she later told somebody that she wanted to cling to the prophet. She regretted what she had done. And I argue that there's no evidence that marriage was consummated either. And I think if it had been, that Flora would have been very hesitant to go out and then get legally married to another guy, because in her mind she was fully married to Joseph. But Joseph granted a divorce from him. And not everybody knows that one of the wives on those lists was granted we would say a cancellation today, but she was allowed to marry civilly with Joseph's approval. even though it kind of didn't unfold the way that we traditionally would expect. So those are the three youngest wives. Again, no evidence of sexuality, but then we get into the wives that are older, 17, 18, 19. There is evidence that some of those were consummated. And the evidence is quite good. There are depositions taken under oath that these. We don't have any evidence of children. There have been 8 of potential offspring that have been tested by Ugo Perigo, who he probably told you all about that. I think, didn't you interview Ugo?
Yeah.
But there is evidence of children, and this is kind of an important point. People will say, well, there's no evidence of children. No, that isn't true. There's just no DNA evidence of children. There's the account from Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who said on several occasions that she knew of 2 or 3 of Joseph's children by plural wives, but that they went by other names. Other families were raising these children as their own. And then there's the account from George Albert Smith through his wife, Bathsheba, I think, that one night George was going up to the mansion house and Joseph was out washing his hands, and George says, "What's up?" And Joseph said, "Well, one of my plural wives just delivered a baby, and Emma was the midwife." So Emma's participating according to that story, and there's a child to one of the plural wives. So there absolutely is evidence that these marriages were consummated and that there were children, but no DNA evidence to date.
Thanks for that, Brian. I wanted to say what Michael, Angeline's dad, the president of our Joseph Jr. family organization, and he said this on a podcast. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but he said, it was a video. He said, so he was asked, well, what would you do if someone comes forth and proves they were of Joseph's blood? And he said, well, if they have the DNA, they're ours. And we'll say, welcome. You know, it isn't like we're going to close the door on anybody.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a good answer. The other question, okay, nope, that wasn't it. Okay, somebody did want me to ask if Joseph was sealed to any boys. They had heard that they were sealed as like a brother or something.
Well, the answer is no. However, what we find is that in the Nauvoo temple, there were sealings of parents to non-biological offspring. These would have been people. Nobody was born in the covenant, in that before that time, because there was no span of time for that to occur. It was a new thing. But in the Nauvoo temple, there were some families who were sealed to parents, and we would call them adoption sealings today. And Joseph Smith taught, and Brigham reiterated this several times, that those sealings can only happen in a temple. In other words, you can seal horizontally, husband to wife, outside of a temple with the expectation that that will be reperformed in a temple setting where a record is kept. But you cannot perform a vertical sealing where a child is sealed to parents, okay, for eternity. That has to be done in a temple, and that's been the policy all along. So there were about 220 of these done in the Nauvoo temple. And the question is, was Joseph sealed to anybody in there? And I see Gracia is nodding her head. You know who that was.
I don't know who. I could probably look, because I have a source. But I'll tell you what, Joseph was sealed to families, had families sealed to him. And then Wilford Woodruff later, as talking about the adoption principle, he suggested now, or he said, it is the will of the Lord that we do the temple work for our own ancestors. Before that, it was kind of like, if you thought your family would join the church, then do the temple work for them. But if not, then they wanted to be sealed to a general authority. And some of the families wanted to have that sealing. And Wilford Woodruff said, this is not the way it should be, and we're going to correct this. And there will be no more of these adoption sealings. You will do your own ancestry from generation to generation as much as you can.
Yeah, wonderful. And in the Nauvoo temple, there was only one sealing, adoption sealing to Joseph, and it was John Bernheisel, who was a trusted
Yes.
friend. But what's interesting is the record doesn't have a wife there. In other words, you're always sealed to a couple. You're never just sealed a child to a father or a mother singly. But in this case, the wife's name is not there. It clearly wasn't Emma. And so if there was a proxy wife there, we don't know who it was, but he had several plural wives that were actually working in the temple. So it could have happened that way and they didn't record her name. Or maybe this was just an exceptional case. But for the family, as you well know, that Joseph Smith died and he was not sealed to any of his children. And he was not sealed to his parents either, because these vertical sealings of child to parent have to be done in the temple. The temple hadn't been finished. And so, of course, David was conceived in the covenant and was born after his death. So he would have been the only child sealed to Joseph through that mechanism. So.
How well we know that. It took many years of applying for that to be entirely accomplished.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it has been.
Yeah. Was Brigham Young, as a prophet just like Joseph, the only one to approve polygamy? Like Joseph was able to approve and allow couples or polygamy couples together. Was he the only one, or how did it get sent down from Joseph? I don't know. How did that work?
Oh, it's a great question. Very important question, especially for Mormon fundamentalists. But what we understand is that Joseph, of course, is the one man on earth at a time during his lifetime, one on earth. I mean, the Lord is very plain that when Joseph dies, he's not on earth. You know, he's in the spirit world, which may be here, but that's not the context. So from that point, the keys to seal, the one man, we believe, was the senior apostle, and that was Brigham Young. And of course, there was some adjusting. The first presidency wasn't reorganized for 3 years, and some of the apostles went off and they were sealing without Brigham's authority, and Brigham had to corral them in. And William Smith thought because he was the patriarch that he could do it as well, and Brigham wrote that very nice letter that helps clarify the keys and the seniority issues to help us understand. So what we find is that during Joseph's lifetime, he had to approve every one. And what's interesting is that verse 18 of section 132 seems to be written to address this question. And I think it's also a verse that is made for our fundamentalist friends. And I have many Mormon fundamentalists who are polygamists today, and they're my friends, and they're great people. They're very devout. But I wish they would take very seriously verse 18, because it says, if a man marry a wife and make a covenant with her for time and all eternity, if that covenant is not by me or by my word, and is not sealed through him who I have anointed and appointed to this power, then it is not valid. So this is how the order is maintained. It's through that one man that is introduced in verse 7. But verse 18 tells us that he truly does control all of the eternal marriages. And this is what happened with Brigham. Brigham Young had to approve them all. Sometimes he would delegate the authority, or he would let the 12 make those decisions, but he could rescind that at any time. It wasn't like Brigham could authorize somebody to make those decisions, and then when Brigham is dead, they still have that authority. It all was in the one man. Now, in the during John Taylor's time, when there was great persecution from the government, what we find is that John Taylor allowed lots of people peripherally to make local decisions to seal marriages that were valid. But that was John Taylor's decision. He could have rescinded it at any time. When he died, that permission died with him. And so it was up to Wilford Woodruff then to decide how are we going to allow these keys to be exercised. So when he gave the manifesto that we alluded to earlier, the only opinion about that document that mattered was Wilford Woodruff's. Because if somebody said, "Oh no, I don't believe that," well, I'm going to be a polygamist, and you'd say, "Well, how can you do that? You can't freelance an eternal ordinance. You have to have the authority of the one man." And this is something that is so important even today for our fundamentalist friends. I wish they would study the line of authority, because I did. The first books I wrote were on fundamentalist authority because I couldn't find a credible line of authority. And as I studied it out and prayed, I came to believe that historically it doesn't make sense, but also spiritually it didn't make sense. So that's kind of a longer answer maybe than you were looking for, Angeline, but kind of addressing that issue. Gracia, you're nodding your head again.
I'm just
Anything
itching
else?
to tell you. In my 1992 Ensign article, Finding My Great Great Grandmother Emma Hale Smith, one of the points that I put in that article is that Joseph was called upon to deal with improper sealing, plural sealing, and or people pretending to do it without authorization. And he makes the statement, I can't quote it all of a sudden without it in my eyes, but he says, as I understand it, I am the only person authorized to perform this at this time. And so what he's saying is that he held that authority. And I put that in that article. And I have to tell you that when that article was about to go to press, there was some kickback from Correlation. And J. Todd had to take that difficulty to the First Presidency and discuss this issue. And he called me and told me, he said, would you be willing to drop out that center part and just be about your family? And I said, if a descendant of Emma and Joseph cannot address this issue, whoever will. So he went. But I wasn't worried about it because I had already talked through all of those issues with the secretary of the First Presidency at that moment. And I knew that there would be clarification on the part of it, because in some cases I had to even find out what words I could dare use in describing these things, because you don't want to go into public print making some stupid statement that you just think might be true. And so it was clarified before it went into press and it came out. And it is an article that has no perfection. It has a couple of silly little errors in terms of the timeline or something or other, and I always intended to fix them, but it doesn't destroy the testimony or the facts as they stood. And that Ensign article went to the world. It did not go into the Liahona, but it is available now in several different languages through our family website.
In fact, just a caveat on that, Mom, it's on the website's willingjosephsmithliahona.org, where my mom's Ensign article is available in multiple languages. But I have a question for you, Brian. There's an article that I found. It's titled Faith, Femininity, and the Frontier: The Life of Martha Jane Knowlton Corey. It was written by an Amy Reynolds Billings, I think in 2002. And there's a quote in there where she mentions Joseph's brother Hiram Smith privately taught Martha and Howard the doctrine of celestial or plural marriage prior to the public announcement of the practice. Is that something that you've ever heard or read?
Yes, in fact, theirs is an interesting account because if I remember correctly, that he taught them kind of in a private setting and then allowed them subsequently to be sealed to one another without entering into a plural marriage. Howard Corey, her husband, didn't have to become a polygamist for them to enjoy the eternal marriage ceremony, which is kind of evidence that polygamy was being commanded, but the greater covenant was that of just having the eternal marriage between them. Again, I think I'm recalling the right couple, but Hiram was the one who did the teaching, and I think they were even on a carriage for part of it, and later allowed them to be sealed, even though polygamy was nowhere being discussed.
Now to caveat on what you just said, they actually went to Utah in 1850, roughly, and in 1852 he did marry a second wife. But what's interesting, and in this article that I read, um, both of their journals pretty much didn't say anything for 3 years, from 1852 to 1855, and he and his second wife actually were divorced in 1855. But what's interesting is there were no children with the second wife, but they stayed stalwart members of the church and backers and supporters of the prophet and president of the church, Brigham Young. But back to the original question that Angeline asked, which, by the way, that was my question that I gave to her. Yeah, I'll take credit for it. Because when I read that article, when they were in the Midwest waiting to come, to basically come out to Utah, Howard's sister was married to a member of the church, and the stake president basically told Howard's, his brother-in-law, that he was to take a second wife. And Howard's sister was really upset about this and went into Howard's cabin and basically said, how could, this is wrong. I don't want him to have a second wife. And Howard looked at his sister and said, I wish you could talk to Brigham Young, because you would understand this is not Brigham Young's Mormonism. And unfortunately, because of that, his sister actually left the church and became an anti-Mormon for the rest of her life, fighting against the church. But even with that, Howard and his wife Martha continued on to Utah, and as I said, were staunch supporters of the church and of plural marriage, the doctrine itself, for the rest of their life. Even after, during that 3-year time period, they never practiced plural marriage after that. And so that was where I was asking, because, and I've been curious with plural marriage and the authorization of it, and there only being one person, technically the prophet, who holds those keys. Did any plural marriage performed anywhere require the knowledge and permission straight from the prophet himself? And in this case, after Joseph Smith was killed, it would be Brigham Young.
Well, I think the way I understand it is he maintained full control, but sometimes he would delegate individuals who would go out and and make decisions locally. But in every case, they were authorized by him, and they couldn't really freelance or give it to somebody else. The one man who held the keys always understood himself as the one man holding the keys, and so
Right.
they would have maintained order through that. But I don't know that every single one had to go up. When the Salt Lake Temple was opened in 1893, my understanding is that a member of the first presidency had to sign every temple recommend. And you can imagine how that needed to be eventually delegated to be, just because it was too much work. So the control was there, but how they exercised it was within their purview to decide.
Okay. Well, thank you. And that was kind of my understanding, is that it was very, it wasn't something that was just allowed to be done by anybody.
Well, we have an account from Brigham that in Nauvoo, Hiram, when Joseph was out of town, he was up at Dixon. Hiram performed a marriage ceremony without getting Joseph's permission. And when he came back, Joseph told him that wasn't right and don't do it again. So, an episode teaching this very principle. So.
Yep. Okay. Back to you, Angeline.
So some also asked or have commented that Brigham Young instituted polygamy and not Joseph. How would you clear that up?
Yeah, this is there's a podcast called 132 Problems with Michelle Brady Stone is the host there, and I was actually on her show on episode 48 or something, and I pointed out to Michelle that the evidence is very clear to most objective scholars. I could say all objective scholars, that Joseph did practice this. But I also taught the principle that Joseph Smith taught, that it is contrary to the economy of heaven for God to inspire somebody with inspiration for somebody who is over them. There's order. The house of God has order. And so if I or Michelle claim that God is inspiring us to correct the church's teachings or doctrines or history, we can know that we're not inspired by Joseph's God, because he works, and Joseph taught this, through the key holders, the 15 men, the 12 apostles in the first presidency. They are not only in charge of all the ordinances, they're in charge of all of our doctrines and teachings and history. And so God isn't going to inspire me to correct them. God will work through them in his own timetable. And that was a principle that I taught to her on this podcast. But it didn't have any effect. She felt very much authorized to go forward and teach that Joseph did not practice plural marriage. We call them polygamy deniers, but that's kind of negative. So maybe monogamy affirmers. That's been a term that they've been using lately. And I don't want to get into a shouting match with them over it. But let me just point out one single thing, that anybody who believes that Joseph Smith did not introduce and practice plural marriage also is telling us that Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow were all liars, because they all taught about how Joseph practiced it and instructed them to enter into it. And each of these four men, who were the next four presidents of the church, were polygamists and told this story on multiple occasions. And so the problem with this is, and I've said that people who embrace this polygamy denying narrative, it's a halfway house to just apostasy, because how can we believe that Joseph Smith was a true prophet and as a monogamist, and then believe that the second, third, fourth, and fifth presidents were all liars and part of a conspiracy, and then believe that President Nelson is a true prophet that we can follow and put our confidence in? You see, there's just, I don't know, that would be a very difficult, I think, faith position to take. Much more difficult than just saying, yeah, Joseph was commanded to restore the practice of polygamy. In my mind, that's an easier narrative to embrace than to embrace the idea that all of these subsequent presidents were liars. And President Nelson today also instructs us that way, that Joseph did introduce it, so you've got to reject him as well. So when people come up with this narrative, the history is totally against them, But I would also say that having faith in the restoration is against them as well, because there's just no way to maintain that narrative and faith in Joseph Smith and the restoration, at least from my perspective.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. What comes to my mind, and I had one conversation with an individual that was mentioned, and as I think about my mom's testimony and the testimony of my grandmother, because these questions existed in 1955 and in 1956 when my mom joined the church, but in 1955, when my mom received the Book of Mormon from missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when he handed that book to her and he said, "This book was translated by the power of God, by your great-great-grandfather, and it is true." My mom says that energy and a light went through her whole body, and the words just resounded in her ears. It's true, it's true, it's true. And that is a testimony that's irrefutable and has carried her as she has studied and had to work through these issues or questions that have popped up in the last 69 years since she was baptized. Because at the time, she didn't know anything about anything. She didn't know anything about anything. I know, Mom, I'm speaking for you, but
That's fine.
I need to emphasize this. The testimonies of millions since the martyrdom of Joseph Smith testifies to the truthfulness of the restored gospel and the line of authority that was passed to Brigham Young, to John Taylor, to Wilford Woodruff, to each prophet, all the way down to our living prophet, Russell M. Nelson, right now, and the 12 living apostles. But not only was my mom affected by that testimony, but 23 years later, the great-granddaughter of Emma and Joseph, who was born in Iowa and grew up in that environment with a great prejudice towards the Utah Mormons and Brigham Young. 23 years later, at the age of 64, my grandmother joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And a friend of hers, when she expressed her desire that she was going to get baptized into the church, he stormed out of her house because they had an argument. And he yelled over his shoulder a needle dig, verbal dig, knowing that it would hit the prejudices of the family really specifically. He yelled, "And what are you going to do about Brigham Young?" And my grandma, at the age of 64, after watching my mother for 23 years grow and learn and progress in the gospel, yells back at this dear friend of hers, "I'm not going to do anything about Brigham Young. The problem is with me, not him." And that is something that I would like to pass on to people who are struggling with these issues of polygamy and line of authority. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to question. But you need to remember that your exaltation, your salvation is between you and Heavenly Father. And are your struggles an issue with that issue, or is that the issue between you and Heavenly Father?
And my mother, in her very old age, after being in the church and becoming the first missionary that served a mission as a descendant of the prophet, she said, the longer I live, the more sense it makes. And then she hopes that we will all know that we're children of God.
I love that. I think that's beautiful.
She must have made dozens of Afghans where she worked at intern needlework to make the letters in her crocheted baby Afghans. I am a child of God. And that became her theme song. And she loved that principle.
And this is actually verbatim her testimony, quoting my grandmother. I understand more fully what it means to say, I am a child of God. I know that God is our loving Heavenly Father. I know that we all lived with Him before we were born into this world. Sorry. And that He knows and loves each one of us. We came to earth to learn by experience, to desire to choose the right, then through faith in our Savior and the atonement He made for us, we may return to our Heavenly Father to be with Him and with our loved ones forever. I hope you will remember that you are a child of God. Unquote.
Thank you.
So I do have another question, one more question, I think. So would you talk about the continuation of the restoration of the gospel and how plural marriage ended and when it ended and who ended it?
Again, a really great question. Jan Ships has made the observation that the saints accepted polygamy about as gradually as they let go of it. You know, in the early 1840s and 50s, they accepted it slowly, and then from 1890 onward, they let it go slowly. The process was one where and at the time things are happening fast, and not everything is as clear as I think we can look back and say. But when Wilford Woodruff said we're not going to do polygamy anymore, the commandment is being removed. And over the pulpit, there were times when the saints did hear that they had to be a polygamist to receive all of God's blessings. Now, no church president has ever said that every man in the celestial kingdom is a polygamist. I don't believe that that will be the case. It would take twice as many worthy women, just logistically, which there aren't. There probably will be polygamy there. I mean, that's part of our theology today. But the no president has said that it's a requirement for exaltation, although during the 1840s to 1890, it was taught that if you want to be fully obedient, you need to be practicing plural marriage. And so that was kind of what was removed with the 1890 manifesto that Wilford Woodruff presented. However, during the next 14 years, through Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, and then Joseph F. Smith, who were the three presidents in that period, they were allowing additional plural marriages secretly. And they were trying to have these be done in Canada or in Mexico. I know of one that was performed on a ship in, I think it was the San Francisco Bay, ostensibly to remove it from the United States somehow. But a lot of these, and especially as the years went on, were performed in Utah. And so by 1904, the government had very strong proof. The Salt Lake Tribune had published a full list, and it was an accurate list, of men who had entered into plural marriage after 1890, which showed the government that the church really wasn't being truthful. And they subpoenaed Joseph F. Smith. He went back to Washington. He testified and he defended polygamy. But the prosecutor there, his name was Taylor, made the observation during the deposition. He said, I think, President Smith, you understand the English language differently than I understand the English language. It was because Joseph was having to choose very special words to try to not admit to things that actually were occurring. And so he came back from that Washington visit, and he was fully steeled against allowing any more plural marriages. As the one man holding the keys, I cannot find him authorizing a single prospective plural marriage after April of 1904. But again, the saints are letting go of it slowly. John W. Taylor didn't seem to be as worried about the one man holding the keys because he'd had authority before. And so he went on and sealed a few marriages. Matthias Cowley as well. They were dropped from the quorum. John W. Taylor was excommunicated. But over the next few years, eventually all of the 12 are committed to this idea. By 1920, what we find outside of the church is that and even inside the church, there's some members who still want to do it. But these are members who know they have to have authority. You just can't feel good in your bosom and say, I'm going to go get married, okay? They recognize the need for proper authority, and so some of them were going to patriarchs. You know, a patriarch will seal a patriarchal blessing on your head. And so some of them were saying, hey, he can also seal a marriage between us, which is preposterous, not good logic, not doctrine. There were some who were going to sealers who had authority under a previous president and saying, can you seal me today? And they would do it. John W. Woolley was both a patriarch and did it like this. But these aren't people who have a direct conduit to Joseph Smith or to the current president until the early 1920s, when a guy named Loren Woolley remembered. He'd never mentioned it before that, so far as we have any record, that back in 1886, he'd been given authority to continue polygamy outside of the church. We have other claims by guys like LeBaron. I won't go through those unless you want me to, and also the Kingstons claim authority, recognizing that there is a need. But about half of the polygamists that we know of today, like the Warren Jeffs group, the Allred group, they claim authority through this guy named Loren Woolley. I've written a book and pamphlets on this topic. I'm not impressed there's any authority there. Please don't be deceived, anyone. But then there are these other lines. And today, so many of these polygamists just pray about it and don't worry about it. And I think that's a really problematic position based on verse 18 that we talked about earlier. So that's kind of brings us through that period. Any questions about that?
No. Do you, Gracia, have any questions or comments, or David?
I don't have any. Thank you.
No, none here. Well, I always have comments or questions, but I'll be nice for the moment.
Okay.
Thank you very much for everything.
Is there anything you think we should include in here, Brian, and speak to?
Well, you've been very kind to let me speak a lot, and I hope your audience is willing to listen to all of this. But I would just tell you that my study of this controversial topic brought me closer to Joseph as a prophet, and my convictions were very much sustained. The only thing I would add is, while I was researching plural marriage, sometimes people would ask me if I was worried about what I'd find out about Joseph, that I'd learned something about Joseph that would make me lose faith in him. And in my mind, I was thinking in 1829, he dictated the Book of Mormon. He didn't have the skills to do it. I reasoned in my head. So he must have been a prophet in 1829. And I just didn't think I was going to find anything that would make me disbelieve or make me think he lost that ability. And so when I finished my polygamy research, which would have been about 10 years ago, I decided to test that theory. Could Joseph Smith have created the Book of Mormon using his own intellect, which happens to be the most popular theory today? If you talk to critics today, most of them will say, oh, yeah, he could do it. Just because I can't do it doesn't mean he couldn't do it. Well, I wanted to test that theory. So for the last 10 years, that's been the focus of my research. And I have a book coming out next year by Great Cofford Books where we examine this idea. But the Book of Mormon is so complex and lengthy. It has 77 storylines, 147 geographical locations, 207 individuals. It has over 200 original proper English nouns that are made up, and all of these characteristics that are very complex. And Joseph dictated the first oral draft that is highly refined, and that's just a synopsis. But my findings are that if you look at the historical record, nobody who knew Joseph Smith, not a single person, attributed to him the skills that he would have needed to be able to dictate the Book of Mormon the way that he did. And so what we're finding is this Book of Mormon challenge that Hugh Nibley did. You remember that? And there are other things we've known for a long time. Joseph didn't have the skills, but this research that I'm doing and borrowing from all these scholars shows without any doubt, really, from a historical standpoint, Joseph didn't have those skills. And I would just share that with you. He was a prophet in 29, and again, I didn't find any reason to disbelieve him. And when my book comes out, it'll be an interesting conversation for the skeptics to try to say, well, yeah, he could do it, or he had help, or I don't know what they'll say, but God has given us a miracle. This tangible proof of Joseph's prophethood, because it's really clear he didn't have those skills, and that would be my testimony to you and to your audience.
I love that. We'll have to have you back on after it's out and talk about that.
I would like
That
that.
would be great. Do you guys have anything else to say, David or Gracia?
Let me word this. Emma and Joseph and the descendants and their descendants that are in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would like to express to you specifically and your ancestors, thank you for all that your ancestors did and all that you do now in standing strong and standing firm in your testimony of Joseph Smith. Because of your ancestors doing that, 130 years after the martyrdom, the children of Joseph and Emma were sealed to them in the temple. And we owe you and your ancestors a great debt of gratitude, and we just want to express that to you, that if there's ever anything we can do for you or your family, we always stand ready to support and help you and your family where we can. And we love you.
Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Like I say, this has just been wonderful. I can almost think Joseph's over my shoulder or something here. It's just a wonderful feeling. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being willing to be here and talk about all of this with us. David, do you want to close us out?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us with today's podcast. And once again, thank you, Brian Hales, for joining us from Nauvoo, Illinois. I would definitely believe that Joseph is probably standing behind you, since you are at Nauvoo. When I was sharing my grandma's testimony earlier, I kind of got choked up because I would almost say that I felt her here with us too. And just want everybody to know that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, his atonement is real. And regardless where you are in your understanding and what plateaus you are in your faith and in your testimony, or what issues that you have with history or lack of history, the atonement of Jesus Christ is going to heal and will heal everything that has been broken or will be broken. We just have to remember to turn and face him and ignore the smoke screens that the adversary puts up to distract us from what's really important. And it is turning and facing our Savior Jesus Christ with all of our hearts and all of our souls. And we need to stand together, united in our faith and testimony. And I share this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.